Our next topic is that of ideology. So, by the ideology of a society or civilization, we mean its norms, its way of life, its worldview, its values, its aesthetic tastes. And people value ideological conformity. They like to be surrounded by people who share the same ideologies themselves, the same values, the same tastes, the same worldview. In a certain psychology experiment, people were put into groups to work on a certain task, and they were given the opportunity at the end to vote out the member of the group who they considered the least effective or the least helpful. And some of the groups were given a devil's advocate, someone who was awkward and didn't go along with the majority view, but presented other ways of thinking about things. And it was found that the groups that contained a devil's advocate tended to be more effective at doing the task. They thought more deeply about it, they considered more options, they came up with better solutions. But when they were asked to vote somebody out, they voted out the devil's advocate, the awkward person. They preferred to be in a group with people who thought like themselves. And so we can imagine that that human tendency is going to operate in societies and civilizations to home in on a common ideology that will be propagated through education and peer pressure. Now, in talking about ideology, we'll divide this into several parts. And in this first part, we'll consider some sort of general background principles. And the first issue is that of complexification. So over the course of social evolution, societies have become more complex. They develop more complex ideologies, more complex sets of norms, more complex ways of life, more complex worldviews. And why is that? Well, one suggestion is that it's due to easier living. So as people have become more effective at getting their food, they've had more time on their hands that isn't spent just on, hunting for animals and vegetables. Is leisure time, so that they can spend on non-productive activities. And that has given them time then to create art, to dream up philosophies, to make things that they can then trade with other people that, aren't necessities of life, but trinkets like beads, for example. So develop commerce. And so these are the things that have made our ways of life more complex, and our norms and our values surrounding all these things more complex. Another suggestion is that it's the sheer size of societies. That as societies have become bigger, they've had more problems to confront, more types of situation to manage. The ways of life that work in a simple band just wouldn't work in a city of 1 million people. When you've got a city, you've got to think about getting food and water in, you've got to think about getting the waste out, you've got to think about how you deal with criminals, you've got to think about how you make collective decisions about where to build, where to farm, and so on. So the sheer increase in size has led to more complex institutions. And another suggestion is that it's just a case of positive feedback. So that as society becomes more complex, it gives new opportunities to create even greater complexity. So, for example, when societies got large enough that they had to invent writing to deal with the bureaucratic problems that they were facing, then writing itself became a vehicle for academic scholarship, so allowing people to develop even more complex and sophisticated ideas. So complexity feeds on itself and leads to more complexity. And then a final suggestion is that it's related to the increased lethality of weapons. So that as weapons become better at killing people, then we have needed better institutions to control and manage the use of those weapons. And a couple of Russian researchers who write about this give an illustration which, based on my sort of looking into it, seems a bit apocryphal, but nevertheless illustrates the point, which is that in the Vietnam War times, a certain Stone Age tribe in southern Vietnam, in the mountains of southern Vietnam, was given access to rifles, and they quickly, wiped out their own tribe by killing each other. The point being that their social institutions were designed for a Stone Age environment where the worst threats you faced were hitting people with sticks and stones, and they suddenly had rifles that could shoot people much further away and more accurately, and they just used them the same way they would have used sticks and stones, and so they wiped each other out because of the much greater lethality of the weapons they were using without the institutions to match. And so we can say, sort of summarising some of this, that through history, through social evolution, there has been the growth of population and the growth of technology. And with population growth, it's made more people, so more opportunities for disputes and just generally more complex situations to manage with so many people around. And technology growth has done things like affected the lethality of weapons. So, people are more effective at killing each other, doing harm to each other. So this has led to a series of crises which have forced people to create more complex institutions, to complexify their societies, to come up with new institutions, or we can say new social technologies, to match the capabilities of their material technologies. So, for example, the Second World War gave rise to the new social technology of the Second World War, which was much more violent because of things like jet aircraft eventually, and many more technologies of military technologies. So it was a very violent war, killed more people than any in history. That led to the new social technology of the United Nations. People said, we need better ways of managing international relations, managing international disputes. And that, people might say, had happened earlier with the First World War, led to the League of Nations. It was a kind of further increment in the complexity of that technology of an international forum. And just to refer back to something covered in Module 2, these two things, when I talked about the dimensions of society, these two things could be summed up under the word scale, the dimension of society's scale. Scale is a measure of social interactivity, the amount of interaction between people. So having more people around increases scale because there's more people to interact with, and also technology growth by providing transport and communications allows you to move further and faster, or to talk over longer distances. That gives more opportunity for interaction as well. So both of those represent increases in the amount of human interaction, and it's this increase in scale that leads to these crises when the scale has increased beyond the capacity of what social institutions are suited to manage. And so out of those crises, people come up with new institutions and more complex ones to manage the more complex problems that are arising. And this is really just a restatement of this, but in a more elaborate way. That, you know, it's sheer increase in size of societies that has led to increased complexity. The next issue we'll consider is that of functionalism. So this is the idea that social institutions perform some function. They're functional, they're adaptive, they're there for a purpose. So it might be, for example, certain religions have dietary rules, and the functional argument would be that is because it is adaptive. So, for example, if a religion forbids pork, it's because of the parasites that grow in pigs and can be transmitted to humans. So not eating pork is adaptive because it avoids exposure to those parasites. But anthropologists don't necessarily believe that. The anthropologist Mary Douglas particularly pointed out in her book Purity and Danger that if you actually look at these dietary rules, it doesn't seem really to be related to particular diseases. It's more to do with excluding things that are odd or that don't fit. So the problem with pigs is that they have cloven hooves, but they don't chew the cud. So they're kind of odd ones out. And for that reason, they're seen as a bit weird and therefore shouldn't be treated as food. Similarly, shellfish are excluded because they live in water, but they're not fish. So better not eat those. So the idea that social institutions are always functional is, it's kind of popular one, but not necessarily believed by sociologists and anthropologists in academia. And the anthropologist C R Hallpike said that with social institutions, it's not so much that they're adaptive, the survival of the fittest, the best institutions survive, but he says it's more like the survival of the mediocre. So he's saying that social institutions persist, if they're reasonably okay, so long as they're not, obviously harmful, then they persist. So there's a huge amount of arbitrariness to it. The way people do things is not necessarily for a useful purpose. And a couple of examples he gives are that two African tribes have a common ancestry and very similar cultures, even though their subsistence activities are very different. One are farmers, farm the land, and the others are pastoralists, tend flocks. And so the culture, he would say, reflects ancestry, not subsistence activities. So you can't say that this particular culture he's talking about, of these two African tribes, is ideally suited to the problems presented by those societies, because they're two completely different societies. They make their livings in completely different ways. And so you wouldn't expect what suits one to suit the other, and yet they have the same culture, and that's because it's passed down. And so that suggests it is an arbitrary way of thinking about the world, an arbitrary set of values. Doesn't really matter what it's going to be used for. And his second example is in the case of New Guinea, pig feasts. So in New Guinea, people breed pigs, but they don't eat pork a lot of the time. But they just grow their herds of pigs more and more, And the pigs create terrible chaos. They roam through the villages, knocking things over, destroying things. And but every so often, every few years, they have a huge feast. And they slaughter thousands of pigs, far more than they can possibly eat. So a lot of it just goes to waste. And Hallpike says, no way can you call this functional. People have tried to suggest, oh, it's adaptive for this reason or that, it gives them protein or something. But he says, the pigs do an enormous amount of damage, and then when they do eat them, they kill so many they can't finish them off. This isn't functional. This is just crazy. Now Hallpike, is when I was doing anthropology, my tutor said, when I once quoted something that Hallpike had said, he said, "Oh well, Hallpike, he's a fascist, isn't he?" Which I found a bit strange. But Hallpike isn't particularly necessarily sort of well regarded among anthropologists, and we'll perhaps see one of the reasons why that is in a moment. But this is another perspective on this idea of functionalism. So, functionalism, I mention it particularly because people who aren't necessarily trained in these fields often, have a sort of intuitive feel that functionalism is the explanation for things like why people don't eat pork. But it's when you study sociology and anthropology at an academic level, you realise there are contradictions to that idea. So we're not necessarily going to try and resolve that here, but to be aware that there are these different perspectives on it. Okay, our next issue is going to be that of measuring cultural complexity. So I said that through social evolution, societies have become more complex, and people talk about the complexity of societies. But the question is, well, how do we measure cultural complexity? If we're going to talk about it, we need to be able to say what the complexity of societies is, so that we can demonstrate that their complexity has increased. And some suggestions for measuring it are the size of the largest settlement. So, in a simple family band, there's just a few people in the largest settlement. In a modern state, this largest settlement has millions of people. And as we look at societies of intermediate complexity, always the size of the largest settlement seems to vary with what we would intuitively consider the level of complexity of the society. Another suggestion is the number of craft specialisms. So, we can have potters and carpenters and blacksmiths and cart drivers and so on. So the more specialisms there are, the more complex the society would be considered to be. Another thing is the number of the layers in the administrative hierarchy. So in a simple family band of people who live off the land, there's no hierarchy, there are no layers, everybody's equal. Then you move up to simple villages that might have a headman, and then you can move up to more complex chiefdoms that have a paramount chief ruling over lower chiefs, and so on, until you get to modern societies where you've got many layers in the bureaucracy, from the king or president at the top down to the low-level councillors and local civil service. And a fourth possibility is to do with technological evolution. So as we'll discuss in the next module, which is on social evolution and progress, technologies come in a particular order, or tend to come in a particular order. So societies develop pottery before they develop printing, and they develop printing before they develop rocket science. So we can see how complex a society is depending on where it is along this technological evolution timeline. So you know, people have drawn up lists of technologies from the simplest to the most complex, and you can sort of count which ones a society has, and it's about here, and that gives you a measure of its complexity. And the anthropologist Garry Chick points out that one of the problems, though, of creating a metric for complexity is that the behaviours in a society or the institutions in a society don't vary monotonically. So they don't necessarily just increase. So let's give an example. So if we look at the amount of leisure time that people have in different or societies of different complexity, so hunting societies, so those we would consider the simplest type of societies, farming societies which are more complex, and then industrial societies which are the most complex. The amount of leisure time that people has goes something like that. Hunting peoples actually have quite a lot of leisure time. The anthropologist Marshall Salins called these societies the original affluent societies. So they can spend just 4 hours a day gathering food, and they've got the rest of the time to amuse themselves. But farmers, their work is very hard and is never done. There's all sort, you know, weeding the fields to do, and feeding and watering the animals and so on. So their days are full. They have very little leisure time. And then back into industrial societies, modern industrial societies, you know, people work a 9 to 5, and they have a lot of spare time in their evenings and weekends. And the same applies for another thing like the age of productive activity. So the age at which children start to become economically or participate in economic activity. So again, in hunting societies, children are very much indulged, and they you know, aren't given work to do. They are already into their teens by the time they're starting to be involved in the hunt. Whereas in farming societies, you know, very young children are given a bucket to go and fill from the river or what have you, or grain to go and throw to the chickens, etc. But then back into industrial societies, again, now children are you know, get to their teens before they're expected to enter the workplace. So it goes up and down. So, you know, these things aren't going to be a good measure of complexity. And just to give one final example is the number of children, the fertility of families. This time, if I just put hunting, farming and industrial societies, this time it goes the other way. Hunting people tend to restrict their fertility. They try to keep the size of their band at the same level from generation to generation, just suited to what the environment can support. But then farmers, they value children, and they have lots of children because children are useful for doing all those chores that we just discussed. But then back to industrial societies, as people get affluent again, they and perhaps because they are more sure that their children will survive to adulthood, say, but for whatever reason they have fewer children again. So again, that the number of children is not going to be a good measure of complexity, because it doesn't necessarily increase with complexity, it goes up and down. And this same Chick, he found from a factor analysis of a variety of potential metrics of complexity, he said that there were 2 dimensions to complexity. which he called socio-technical complexity and ecological complexity. So socio-technological complexity is to do with the kinds of things we mentioned up here, things like, you know, the invention of writing, craft specialisms, money, the complexity of political institutions, the number of different officials that you have in society and so on, and various other things, but they all seem to vary together. If you had writing, then you had money, and you had more complex political institutions, you had a larger number of specialisms. So these all just vary together. They made one factor, and the other factor, so that's socio-technical complexity. Ecological complexity, he said, is things like, you know, sort of more that the way of life, fixed residence, whether you have that or not, whether you're nomadic or whether you know, stay in one place in a village or town. Population density, agriculture and urbanism. So these things again tended to appear or disappear together. If the population became more dense, then you're more likely to be fixed in your residence, to have agriculture and to have urbanism. So these again come and go together. So they were just those two factors. So for him, these two factors don't come and go together. They're independent. You know, you can have high population density without writing or with writing. So those are two separate factors. But Turchin, Peter Turchin, and a very large team using the C-SHAP database with just a similar factor analysis, found just one dimension, which is basically population, the size of the population, or as I would say, actually more scale, amount of social interaction. But they found that that is the key factor, and there's really just one. As population size increases, then all these things come together. And you know, size of largest settlement is related to that population size. And when we talked about complexification earlier, we identified size as perhaps one of the drivers of complexification. Well, this is confirmed by this Turchin et al. Study. So we've talked about how ideology, norms, culture has become more complex through history, and we've talked about whether the characteristics of ideology are functional or arbitrary, and we've talked about how do you measure ideological or cultural complexity. But the last very important point to notice is that different societies and different civilizations have very different ideologies. So ideology is not just more or less complex, but it can be very different between societies. And in fact, it's found that cultures, ideologies, vary more than political and economic institutions. So let's write that up. So with a political institution like kingship, its features are pretty much the same in all societies that practice kingship, or in fact, you know, we could say that kingship itself is an institution that's found in many, many different societies and throughout history, and it's always got pretty much the same characteristics. And similarly in economic affairs, you know, farmers have pretty much the same lifestyle everywhere on the planet and throughout history. And this is because we could say that they're shaped by the necessities. So these are kind of functional. How farmers behave is going to reflect the needs of farming and drivers of that, like the fact that there are seasons of the year and crops take a certain amount of time to mature and they need fertilization and they need watering and so on. So the way that farmers farm is going to be dictated by those clear constraints. Whereas the fact that culture varies suggests it is not like political and economic institutions driven by needs and constraints. So it suggests it is indeed not functional but more arbitrary. And so each society, civilization has this ideology of its own. And when we started discussing civilizations, we talked about the idea of a super style, a certain character to each civilization. Spengler talks about the soul of a civilization. Each civilization has a unique soul identity. With Toynbee, we saw that religion, and also someone like Huntington, religion, the clash of civilizations, religion as defining a civilization. Hallpike, again, who we just mentioned, talks about the idea of core principles. Each civilization has these core principles that shape everything it does. And he gives the example, say, of gunpowder. And how the reception or treatment of gunpowder was very different in China. It led to fireworks, the invention of fireworks. In Europe, it led to guns. And he says this difference is explained by differences in the core principles of these two societies. When China came across gunpowder, it thought, we can make fireworks with this. When the Europeans came across gunpowder, they thought, we can make guns with this. Jack Goldstone talks about the different effects of the 17th century crisis. That is what some people identify as social disturbances all around the world, like at that time the English Civil War, for example, and there were disturbances all across Eurasia, driven by population growth, technology diffusion, maybe climate, whatever. But there was a global crisis in the 17th century that some people identify. And Jack Goldstone says that we see different responses to this crisis. So in China, they turned inward, cut themselves off from the world, whereas Europe responded to the 17th century crisis by going outward, turning outward, going out to the world, to India and the Far East to trade. So similar situations lead to very different outcomes depending upon the society's core principles or its soul. And another key point is that ideologies of civilizations, some people insist, are different, not better. It's not a question of better or worse, it's just different. So, many people have suggested, for example, that Western democracy is not the ideal. We shouldn't think that societies can be judged as to how far along they've got to Western style democracy. But that, it often is an assumption. Democracy is seen as something that civilizations or other societies need to adopt to bring themselves up to the level of Western society. Well, people interested in cultures and civilizations say, no, it's not like that. democracy may be suitable for the West, but other societies have their own way of doing things. And we can't say that insofar as they're not like Western democracy, then they're somehow inferior. No, they have whatever is suitable for them, or whatever works for them, whatever they want for their own way of life. Jim Penman says, if you look at societies like China, India, the Middle East, in recent times, Europeans have sometimes looked at these societies and considered them somewhat dysfunctional. But Penman says these are great survivors. They've got very high populations for a start. So it shows they're doing something right. Yeah? And they've got 1 billion people each. So whatever they're doing, it seems to work, arguably. That's what Jim Penman says. And similarly in the Middle East, those societies have existed for thousands of years. They're still going strong, or at least they're still going anyway. So they're great survivors. Whatever it is they do is somehow working for them. So these societies have different cultures, different ideologies, but we can't say that they're better or worse than Western or other civilizations. But then someone who does say that is Hallpike. In his book, The Foundations of Primitive Thought, he relies on the work of Piaget, the psychologist Piaget, and particularly his work on child development. So Piaget pointed out that children, for example, have to reach a certain age before they can understand something like the conservation of volume. So if you put water in a wide cylinder like that, or a narrow, tall one like that, if you pour the one into the other, children have to reach a certain level of psychological functioning to recognize that it's the same amount of water. Below a certain age, they'll think that because that's, that level is higher, there's more water in this one. And Hallpike says that then in what he calls primitive societies, they are at lower levels of this child development scale. They can think in concrete terms, but not in formal terms. And that's because they don't have writing, they don't have formal education. So they think about the world in simpler ways that in Western society, children only think about until they've been educated into other ways of looking at these things. So he would say, primitive societies, primitive thought, not necessarily in a pejorative way, but primitive in the sense of what young children have until they've received a more formal education. And so these things affect their cultural attitudes, cultural ideas. So because they think that the water isn't conserved between those and that one has more, then that kind of assumption lies under some of their cultural beliefs and how they then approach the world, and therefore their ideology. So I think you can see then why my anthropology tutor might have said, oh, Hallpike, he's a fascist, isn't he?